Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining myself and Tim for Tim's update on IR35 and planning. Just a quick intro. I'm Tom Adcock. I'm a tax partner here at Gravita. For those of you who don't know, and I'm sure most of you do by now, we're a pretty decent size, quite large accountancy firm and advisory firm based in London, Essex, and Oxford and growing all the time. And we advise clients from all over the world how to navigate the UK tax system. So today, Tim is very kind, is one of our consultants, is going to go through IR35. IR35 has been around forever, but it's constantly changing based on changes in government policy, but also because of tax cases and other interesting things that happen in the world of tax. And so I think it's very important that those that may or may not be affected by it keep abreast of what is there and what is changing and what can be done in order to navigate that. It's kind of an essential part of dealing with contractors and consultants in the modern world. So without further ado, and without mentioning the fact that it's Spurs versus Arsenal later on this evening, Tim, over to you, my friend.
Thank you very much, Tom. Good to see you.
Yeah.
Right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this IR35 webinar. I'm Tim Palmer. I lecture all over the UK. Can I just say, I do lecture all over the UK and I have been for 35, 40 years. I'm going to mention this just very quickly, nothing to do with today's webinar, but I lectured for a company called Quorum Training for many years. Quorum Training, they were based in Tavistock House, Tavistock Square. And 20 years this year, I was standing outside their building, just getting some fresh air, waiting to go back inside to start my all-day lecture there. And I saw the bus blow up from the London bombings in front of me. So, yeah, I do lecture all over the UK. And the reason I'm mentioning that is obviously it's 20 years ago this year. And the BBC Two have had a series of 4 episodes recently. Some of you may have seen them. So it all brought it back all to me when I was watching that on last Sunday and Monday. Yeah, so my lecturing, I've experienced an awful lot. And when you see something like that, you never ever forget it. I still have bad dreams about that now, 20 years on. So my lecturing is combined with human experiences, can we say, human life, good and bad. And as well as my lecturing, I'm a tax consultant with Gravita, which I love my role at Gravita. Really enjoy doing, working with them, super crowd, and it's fun. And as well as being productive and helping accountants, it's enjoyable as well. And when I'm not doing my lectures and my work for Gravita, I write regular articles in tax magazines. So that's enough about me. But I have been involved with IR35 since it started, as Tom said. It came in the year 2000. I think there was a song about that, wasn't it, by Busted? Perhaps it wasn't quite the year 2000. But IR35 did come in 2000. And I've been involved in it ever since, heavily. I've met the revenue on many occasions on IR35, more on that in a moment. Yeah, so I've produced quite a comprehensive set of notes today, 9 pages odd. You want them in front of you throughout this 1-hour presentation. We're going to finish at 10 o'clock today. So have the notes in front of you, and you might want to mark them up with my extra comments right from the word go. If you have any questions today or you need any tax consultancy following the webinar, and I'm sure some of you will, there's the email address there to go to. All right. Okay. IR35, huge area. Now it came in, and I'm going to tell you the truth about it all. It came in a budget in 1999. And I remember it closely because I was lecturing on the budget. And there was this press release, Inland Revenue Press Release 35, that if you looked in the top corner, it was abbreviated to IR35, Inland Revenue Press Release 35. And that's how IR35 came in. And you can call me sad, but I'm looking up in my studio here, and alongside a picture signed of Harry Kane and Pochettino, there's an original copy of the IR35 press release. You can call me sad, can't you? But that's in my office as well. And so it's Inland Revenue Press Release 35, abbreviated to IR35. And they announced that IR35, the attack on one-man band companies, was going to come in from 6th of April 2000, which it did do. Now, a few years ago, I was in a meeting with the revenue, and this revenue inspector who was attacking wrongly on IR35, and we won, and I knew we'd win because it was quite clear that the case wasn't liable to IR35. More on that in a minute. But this inspector turned around and he said, "This is what I do if I'm looking to see if the engagement is caught to IR35." And I thought, this would be interesting. And the inspector turned around in the meeting and he said, "There's two steps to IR35 that we appreciate." And he said, "We've got to find out. Any names I mentioned during this webinar are purely hypothetical." And he said, "I've got to find that to start off." And he said, "I've got to find Bob working through Bob Limited personal service company regularly for a client, say Bovit." So that's step one, if you like. That's what the revenue got to find. If they're looking at an issue and they're considering, is it caught to IR35? That's step one. This is all in very general terms, and this is what the inspector said to me. And then he said, the second stage, he said, we've got to find whether Bob has formed his company deliberately, really, to avoid being an employee of Bovit. So the second stage is, if Bob didn't have the protection of his company, if Bob was working directly for Bovit, would he be an employee of Bovit? And I think even now, that is how HMRC generally approach IR35. What they've got to do is they've got to find that, stage one. This is all in very general terms, but I still feel that HMRC approach it this way. And I've seen it through correspondence as well as meetings over decades. So they find that, and then they think, right, okay, if Bob didn't have the protection of his company, if he was working direct for Bovit, would he be an employee of Bovit? And if the revenue succeed with that, what they then do, if we go back to that, they then ask and demand for pay-as-you-earn and national insurance on Bob Limited's fees from Bovit. How do you avoid IR35? Well, the way to avoid IR35 is you've got to demonstrate that if Bob was working directly for Bovit, he'd be genuinely self-employed. He wouldn't be an employee. That is how you defeat IR35. So what I've just said is the general resume of IR35, right? To defeat IR35, you've got to prove that if Bob was working directly, and this is the power that the revenue have to ask this question, the legislation gives them the power. If Bob was working directly for Bovit, to defeat IR35, you've got to prove that he'd be genuinely self-employed in that relationship, i.e. that Bovit don't control him, that he can refuse to work for them if he's busy with somebody else. There's no mutuality of obligations. He's got a substitute. He pays his own public liability insurance. That's what you've got to prove. And that's the nutshell of R35. I know it's changed slightly and the judges have put different takes on it, but nothing's going to change what I've just said. All right, now just going back, if you go to your notes now and go to page 2 of your notes, I think it is important to see the stages and the history of I-35. So it came in on the 6th of April 2000. And to be honest, for the first 17 years, there was no take. The revenue, the tax was just minuscule because it was left to the personal service companies to report that they were liable. Perhaps they didn't. I don't know. I don't want to get involved in that. But for the first 17 years, there was no real money collected by the government at all from R35. So I think they had a meeting. There was a lot of publicity how little tax it had collected. And the government then decided from 6th of April 2017 that they would make public sector bodies responsible in the public sector if they were engaging a one-man band company. They, not the revenue, they, the public sector body, from 6th of April 2017 were now made responsible for looking at their engagement with Fred Limited and saying those stages that we've just been through, if he didn't have the protection of his company, if he was working directly for the Home Office, for a public sector, for transport, public sector, the fire brigade, all of these I've had dealings with. All of these public sector bodies now, from April 2017 till today and onwards, they have to decide if this engagement between the public sector body and the one-man band company is caught to IR35. And then the government took it one step further on the 6th of April 2021, and they extended it to the private sector. And so if you are a medium or large size engager in the private sector, and you probably know all about how to get to that, I'm not going to go through that today, but if you meet two of those three conditions, you are, can I just call them a large engager? It's much easier than to call them that. You are responsible for IR35 if you engage a personal service company or a partnership. We'll come to partnerships later. So in a nutshell, IR35 came in the year 2000. For the first 17 years, it collected next to no tax. And then in 6th of April 2017, they made public sector bodies responsible for their engagements to see if IR35 applied. And then from 6th of April 2021, they extended the responsibility to medium and large engagers. From now on, they're just going to call them large engagers in the private sector. Right. What's the fallout, the consequences of that? Now, I'm going to say extra things that are not in the notes today because I'm being realistic today on everything I've seen. Probably I've been involved in it as much as anyone. And I'm going to have a little moan here. I've seen public sector bodies repeatedly since 2017. They suddenly realised that, gosh, this engagement is caught to IR35. We got to deduct pay as you earn and national insurance from Fred Limited's fees. And then they suddenly realise, wow, we got to pay employers NIC under IR35 as well because we're a deemed employer. So this in 2017, and this is still the case to today, the public sector bodies think, wow, we got 13.8% employers NIC to account for. And obviously that goes up to 15% horrifically from 6th of April. So what I've seen an awful lot, and it's not right, but it happens, is that the public sector body asks Fred Limited for the employer's NIC. Now that is wrong. Technically, it's unlawful. But they're doing it, perhaps to a lesser scale now, but in particular when it started, it was quite common. And I always thought, wow, this is not right. And can you believe, I mean, obviously every day I have to, it's not a chore, it's something that you're going to think I'm sad here, but I enjoy keeping up to date with all the tax cases and things. And last week it was reported that the Home Office had deducted employers' NIC from a company. You could jot it down. It's not in the notes because we did the notes for a week or so ago. This has only just come to light. I mean, this is a recent case. And the Home Office deducted employers' NIC from a company that they were using, caught to IR35, Tripod Partners Limited. I think it was about 36,000. And I thought, well, that's wrong. It's their liability. It's the public sector body's liability. So if you're an accountant in practice and your client goes and works for a public sector body, you need to check the contract very carefully. But the employer's NIC is the responsibility of the public sector body, and they shouldn't be deducting it from the fees they pay to the personal service company. Right? Yeah, there you go, 36,000. Right, now, the other thing that you've got to really appreciate is that the, can I call it, the large engagers in the private sector are now responsible for IR35, not HMRC. So when the, can I call it large? I know it's medium and large, but can I just call it large for the rest purposes of this webinar? When the large engager, takes on a company that they regularly use, Fred Limited, Joe Limited, the large engager has got to decide, is this engagement court to R35? Would Fred be a deemed employee of us if he didn't have the protection of his company? And if you look at your notes on page 2, I was asked a few years ago now to help an accountant who acted for a car wash company. Joe, there's Joe there. And he had this personal service company. He was really good at car valeting. I mean, he was reliable and he got a very good reputation. And what happened, I've changed the names. So any names that I'm mentioning are hypothetical here. But what happened was you had a huge repair group, can I call it the large engager? And they were regularly using Joe, the car valet company, to clean the cars. Now, you got all the details. Your 9 pages of notes that you need in front of you are very concise, but I'm ad-libbing a bit today because I've got so much to get through in the hour. But this Northern Car Group repaired the cars, and the cars were normally in a really dreadful state. So they asked Joe to pick them up, take them back to his car wash place, valet them inside and out, and then bring them back at the end of the day to the Northern Car Group. And then the owner of the car would come and collect them at 5 o'clock. All of that happened very nicely. Joe valeted the cars. He took out insurance to cover, or his company did, Joe Limited, took out insurance to cover the whole of the time that he collected the car to when he brought it back. There was no control whatsoever by the Northern Car Group over Joe. They just gave him the cars and said, right, we trust you, valet them, bring them back. No control whatsoever. But he was growing, young guy, worked round the clock. I met him, fantastic guy. And he worked for other people as well as the Northern Car Group. And so regularly he had to turn the work down. And they didn't guarantee him work every week, and he couldn't do the work sometimes that was offered to him. So I quickly came to the conclusion there was no control over him and there was no mutuality of obligations. He signed a contract that was very brief. I had a look at it, and it said any complaints that he would come back, but there wasn't really any. He was so reliable. But in the event of a complaint, he would come back and rectify the mistakes for no further payment in his own time. That is a self-employed clause as well. He had a substitute worker when he went on holiday, when he was ill, and the substitute, Freddie, took over from him. But Joe Limited still billed the car valet company, and the substitute billed Joe Limited. So I'm looking at all of this, and I'm thinking, well, this is not court to R35. I mean, if Joe was working directly for the Northern Car Group, he'd be self-employed. And yet, if I push this back, the Northern Car Group came to the conclusion, totally wrongly, that it was court to R35. They sent Joe a status determination statement, and they said, we're going to deduct pay-as-you-earn and national insurance from your fees. Turn over to page 3. I couldn't believe it. So, and they were adamant that they were right when they were totally wrong. And in the end, we had to have a meeting with them. And we pointed out quite strongly why he would be self-employed, why there was no R35. And on the screen are the reasons which I've just mentioned previously. But it took a lot of effort for us to persuade them that it was outside R35. If we hadn't have stepped in, I mean, Joe was lucky that I was helping him in his accountant. If we hadn't have stepped in, pay as you earn would have been deducted. And also, the Northern Group would have had to pay 13.8% employers NIC on big fees over the year, wrongly. So what I'm trying to say so far is there's 2 experiences that I don't like. I don't like public sector bodies trying to get the employer's national insurance from the personal service company. And also, I honestly feel that there is many occasions when the large engagers in the private sector, and I'm still seeing it now, they say that the case is subject to R35 when it isn't. Now, what you've got to do as an accountant in practice, and I know the majority of people watching this webinar today are accountants in practice, you've got to appeal against that wrong status determination decision. So, there's a lot to it, a lot to it. And, having private sector, big engagers responsible is great, but they've got to come to the right decision. Right now, as Tom mentioned in his excellent introduction today, there's been changes of interpretation on the process for IR35, and the most recent change was mentioned in the Kickabout Productions. Was it Paul Hawksby, who's from TalkSport? I think he was the guy who owned that company, and it went to the Court of Appeal, and the judge said in the Court of Appeal in the Hawksby Kickabout Productions case that it's a three-stage process. And very briefly, this just expands what I said at the start. So what the large engagers got to do now, they've got to look at the actual contracts in place, step one. And step two, they've got to ascertain and produce a hypothetical contract, which I said, if Fred didn't have the benefit of his one-man band company, if he was working directly, hypothetically, for the X group. And then step three is to determine what the hypothetical contract tells us and reveals. Would the individual working directly for the engager be an employee or self-employed? So it's just expanding what I said at the start. Right, now very briefly, another case that I was involved in on page 4. So today is real life, reality. We were helping the accountant to Martin Smith, who was a builder, all right? And he formed a company, Martin Smith Construction Limited. And the engager, Lewis, a very big construction group, they looked at this engagement and they had to decide whether it was caught to IR35. They had to decide whether Martin would be a deemed employee of Lewis if he was working without his company. Yeah. And so they went through the procedures very well, I thought, actually, in this case, the Lewis Group. Any names I mention, I'm changing the names. And they quickly came to the conclusion that IR35 didn't apply. They did it correctly. They looked at the contracts in place, they looked at the hypothetical contract, and they looked, as the Kickabout case requires them to do, they looked at whether an engagement would be an employment or self-employment. And to cut this really short, there was no mutuality of obligations. There was no control over him. He was an experienced builder in his late 30s. They gave him the work and they came down, the Lewis Group, practically when it was finished. So they didn't control him. And a bit similar to the car wash case, he had lots of clients and he could, when he was doing work for them, he couldn't do the work for the Lewis Group and he had to turn it down. There was other factors that proved that he was self-employed, i.e. not liable to IR35. His company paid their own public liability insurance. They provided a substitute. Now, when you provide a substitute, it's great if you can actually use the substitute in the year. You don't have to, but it strengthens your case, I think. But always remember two things. The substitute has to be the same technical level as Martin, the individual. And also, if you use the substitute, putting that back, Martin Smith Construction Limited still bills Lewis, and the substitute bills Martin Smith Construction. You never, ever want the substitute billing Lewis, because then it's not your substitute. Okay, so even though the substitute's done the work, Martin Smith Construction still bills Lewis, and the substitute bills Martin Smith's Construction. And this Lewis Group, they had a good firm of accountants acting for them, and the accountants looked at the contracts and looked at all the facts, and they said, yeah, this is not caught to IR35. We're not going to apply IR35. And they sent a status determination to Martin proving that. And I thought, brilliant, these guys are very, very good. So I've experienced, since these fairly recent private sector changes, good and bad. But I must be honest with you, not everyone is like the Lewis Group as an engager. I've seen some engagers wrongly say, if in doubt, apply IR35. You can't do that. You've got to strictly, I know it's difficult, you've got to look at each case on its own facts and merits and determine what's going on. Right now, if we go to page 5, okay, can I go through the steps of IR35? All right, okay, where are we now? Right, so you might want to write in on page 5, this is what happens, the steps, if an engagement is called to IR35. And this now, in the year 2025, is what a large engager has to do. Right, so we're on page 5 of your notes. These are the steps. And you've got a large engager, Bovit, and they're regularly engaging Fred, who works for his company, Fred Limited. And the large engager now is responsible for IR35. And they've got to look at all the facts and determine, would Fred be a deemed employee of Bovit if he was working directly for Bovit? And you've got to remember that if they can come to the conclusion the engagement is caught to IR35, you could mark this up on the top of page 5. What Bovit have to do is to deduct pay-as-you-earn and deduct employees' national insurance from the £100,000 fees that Fred Limited renders to them. What Bovit has to do is to put the fees through their payroll as if they were employing Fred personally. And you might want to write in what a lot of my consultancy clients have done over the last few years. They operate 2 distinctly different payrolls. One payroll for their staff, genuine employees on employment contracts, and another payroll for companies caught to IR35 that they're deducting pay-as-you-earn and national insurance from. And the other thing you've got to remember, if this is caught to IR35, Bovit has to pay huge employers' national insurance of 13.8%, which goes up to 15% next year and could go up even further. Heaven forbid, but that's reality. So let's go through the steps now. So IR35 now, what HMRC really has done is passed the buck, or the government has done, because public sector engagers now have to determine if the engagement is caught to IR35, and if they do, they have to apply IR35 and deduct pay-as-you-earn and national insurance. And from 2021, medium and large, but I'm calling them large throughout the webinar, engagers in the private sector have to decide, is the engagement caught to IR35? They have to give a status determination to the Fred, and if it is caught and they're correct, they deduct pay-as-you-earn and national insurance from Fred Limited's fees. The responsibility is with the large engager, and they put it through the payroll. As I say, they normally have 2 separate payrolls, one for staff and one for companies caught to IR35. Right, now let's go down page 5 of your notes, okay, and let's go down the steps involved. All right, so they've got to decide, Bovit, is the engagement caught to IR35? Would he be a deemed employee of theirs if he was working directly for them? And they have to consider the factors such as, does Bovit control them? Is there mutuality of obligations? Has he got a substitute? Is there financial risk, etc., etc.? Right, okay. So Bovit comes to the conclusion correctly that IR35 does apply, that he would be a deemed employee if he was working directly for them. What do they have to do? Well, they have to give him a status determination stating that either they're going to apply IR35, that they think it applies. He's got the right to appeal against that, as I mentioned earlier in the car wash case that we looked at, which we did appeal against and won. But let's imagine this is completely correct, and it is caught to IR35, and Fred Limited renders fees of £100,000 to Bovit. Bovit's got to put it that £100,000 fees caught to IR35 through their payroll, deduct pay-as-you-earn, deduct national insurance, and also they have to account for employers' NIC. So it's expensive for everyone. and there's extra costs for everyone. And obviously they got the cost of putting it through the payroll, their second payroll, if you like. Now, let's just imagine, purely hypothetically, that they deduct £40,000 worth of pay as you earn, right? And we're on stage 7 at the bottom of page 5 of your notes. Well, the £60,000 fee will be paid net to Fred Limited. But the thing you really got to appreciate, and many accountants don't, and they get this wrong, IR35 has applied to this contract. If I put the diagram back up, right, it's applied to this contract. Fred Limited has rendered the fees of 100,000. Bovitz put the fees through their payroll as if they were employing Fred, deduct £40,000 pay as you earn. But the thing you really want to appreciate, bottom of page 5, the net fee of 60 after the pay as you earn and national insurance of 40 goes to Fred Limited. But the important thing is that it's treated as Fred's employment income, and it has to go on his own personal self-assessment tax return. This is the thing that a lot of accountants don't appreciate and get wrong. Even though the company is billed and received the fee, it's treated as Fred's personal employment income. Bear with me and I'll explain it in a bit more detail in a minute. And at the end of the tax year, Bovit will give a P60 form to Fred, and his accountant has got to put the £100,000 on his personal self-assessment income tax return with a credit for the 40,000 pay as you earn. Can you believe this? But it's true. You have to do it. It's all in the notes. You need to follow these notes. These 9 pages of notes are a godsend. You want to follow them. Turn over to page 6. So this just confirms everything. I'm going to move the slides back. This just confirms everything I've said. So this is treated as employment income of Fred. And ultimately, and I'll prove it in a minute, the company won't pay corporation tax on the £100,000 fees. It's Fred's income. It's reported, and technically it's Fred's employment income. So it goes on his personal self-assessment tax return with a credit for the 40. So 100 goes on with a credit for the 40. Go to the top of page 6. Point number 10. Bringing the slides up to date. At the end of the year, Bovit will give a P60 to Fred, showing the pay-as-you-earn deducted. He gives it to his accountant, and he puts the 100,000 on his tax return with a credit for the 40 pay-as-you-earn. It's Fred's deemed employment income. Right, we're caught up with the notes now. We're on page 6, item 12. What Fred then does, he draws the money out of his company either as a tax-free bonus or a tax-free dividend. That's what he will do. He'll get the money out of his company to pay his mortgage. So he extracts the money, the net 60, out of his company as tax-free salary. So he extracts it in a form tax-free salary or tax-free dividend. Obviously, as I keep saying throughout this webinar, the cost to the engager will be the employer's NIC, which rises to 15% next year, very expensive, and the cost of putting it through the payroll. Right, this is tough, and it's very tough for everyone to do it from all different sides correctly from a technical point of view. Right, point 15. Not many people seem to appreciate this, but IR35 applies equally to partnerships as it does to personal service companies. Indeed, it does. Now, this is not in the notes, but you might just want to jot this down. Gary Lineker, he is the ex-Tottenham striker. As a Tottenham fanatic, I don't have a season ticket anymore because I stopped my season ticket when I was lecturing for the ACCA before COVID on Saturdays, and I've never renewed it. But I do go to quite a few games, and I watch all the Spurs games on TV. I could tell you the youth team players. I know as much about Spurs practically as anyone, and I love Spurs. But as I say, I've got a soft spot for Leyton Orient, who came through their FA Cup tie they beat Derby County in penalties last night. Anyway, Gary Lineker played for Spurs. I remember it well. He had a quiet start, then he started scoring a lot of goals. And I do remember shortly after he joined Tottenham, I think his son George, was it George, was very, very ill, but thankfully he recovered. Right, Gary Lineker then retired playing football. I think he went over to Japan. I think he got injured in Japan and he came back and he started a career, a very successful career in the media. And he started to front Match of the Day. And that all went very well for him. And then what he did, he formed a partnership with his ex-wife, Danielle, um, and they billed the BBC through the partnership for his appearances on Match of the Day, etc. And the revenue attacked the partnership under IR35. This has all been the news quite heavily recently. So you could mark up, and if you go on the internet, you can find all the details of the case. Now, it was due, what the revenue said, they said, you formed this partnership to get round employment at the BBC. Gary, if you were working directly for the BBC, I don't know if I've got the second slide on here, you'd be an employee of the BBC. And they raised very big IR35 determinations on the partnership. He appealed, and it was due to go to the upper tier tribunal this month, or maybe it was at the end of last month. And what happened was he settled out of court, which was very frustrating for me because I wanted to see all the arguments by HMRC on why this partnership was called to IR35. But the reason I'm mentioning this is that if your client is a large engager and they engage a partnership, they still have to make exactly the same decisions. Is this caught to IR35 or not? And if you look at your notes on page 6, I've seen a situation. Have I got this on the slide? No, I don't think I've got it on the screen today, but you can see it's in your notes. I've seen a situation where a large engager has taken on a partnership, and he said, or sorry, the large engager said, this is caught to IR35, and they deducted pay-as-you-earn and national insurance through the partnership, from the partnership's fees. Go to your notes on page 6. So what this bank did, they put the partnership fees through their payroll as if they were employing Larry. So you might want to mark the notes up here. IR35 does very much potentially apply to partnerships depending on the facts and circumstances. Right, the other thing you need to be very clear about, and today in 2025, this is starting to really hit. If you've got the building industry and you've got a very big contractor over in the building industry, and they take on regular subbies who form companies and they use them regularly, the large building contractor has got to look at the engagement and think, well, is this caught to IR35 like any other large engager has to do? If they say, yes, it's caught to IR35, they deduct pay as you earn from Bob the Builder Limited's fees, and SIS doesn't apply. You want to write this in. If you act for building companies, this is starting in 2025 to really hit in practice. And what a lot of large building groups are now doing is they're saying, well, this is caught to IR35, our engagement, we'll deduct pay as you earn. But the big thing to remember is that if IR35 applies, SIS doesn't. Can I say that again? So if this large building engager says to Bob the Builder Limited, well, we use you a lot, we control you, we tell you what to do, you've got to accept the work we give you, there's mutuality of obligations, there's control, it's caught to IR35, the large building contractor has got to put Bob the Builder Limited's fees through their payroll and apply IR35, but SIS doesn't apply. You want to really highlight the notes. You can't have IR35 and SIS. IR35 takes priority over SIS. IR35 applies, pay as you earn applies, SIS doesn't. Right, now, everything I've just said is really important, and I only wish that everybody was complying like they should do, really, but in many, many cases, perhaps they're not. Can I just stop for a moment and just say that Gravita could help you, if you're an accountant in practice, with your client's journey. Now, this is not in the notes, but I thought about this last night when I was just doing my final preparations for this webinar today. And I thought we could really help, Gravita could really help the client from the start. What do I mean? Well, you might have an individual and he's thinking of incorporating. We could assist you with the incorporation. For example, I saw last year an individual incorporating and he had trading losses. And I think it was last chance saloon for him. And I said to the individual, you do realize that you've made those losses as an individual, but you can set them against your future income from the company when you incorporate. If you've got a pen there, you might want to jot down the section 86. I'm just going outside the notes for 2 minutes, and then I'll come back to the notes in a second. But when an individual incorporates, they might have tax-adjusted trading losses as an individual. And a lot of accountants think, well, they have wasted, they're finished as an individual when we incorporate. They're not. Section 86, as long as you meet the conditions of the section, which is fairly easy to do, they allow you as an individual to carry the losses forward and set them against the income that you get from the company. So long as you meet these 3 conditions here. If you Google Section 86 of the Income Taxes Act 2007, you can print it off from the internet. The 3 conditions: you transfer the trade to the company in consideration for shares, and the company continues to carry on the trade, and the shares are continue to be owned by the transferor. And so then, God willing, the company becomes profitable and they pay salary to him, dividends to him. He could have put money in and got loan interest from the company. That's a good thing to do, because obviously there's no national insurance on loan interest. We would advise about that if we were dealing with the incorporation. All that income that he's got from the company, he can then set the income tax losses off against that income under Section 86. So we could take your client through a journey and help him incorporate, and then that client might have one regular big client. If we get involved prior to everything happening, we could advise on how the engagement could be constructed to be outside the IR35 net. And this is something that we do quite a lot, and accountants are quite grateful that we've been involved from the start to protect them, to give them the best tax advice on the incorporation, and to make their company client outside the scope of IR35 in the engagement that it undertakes. We could do all of that for you. And while we're on the background of incorporation, just to mention as we're passing, one of the big things we do obviously is to advise individual landlords when they want to incorporate their rental property portfolio. So incorporation is a big area and very much relevant to obviously the history and the journey under IR35. Right, now getting back to the notes, if you go to page 7, I did say that when a private sector large engager decides IR35 applies, they have to put Bob Limited's fees through their payroll, treat it as a deemed employment, and Bob Limited, or Bob the Builder Limited, gets the fee, but it's treated as Bob's personal employment income. And do you remember me saying the company won't have to pay corporation tax on the fees that they get? Can we now, in this webinar, turn our minds to the corporate tax aspects of IR35? And if you go to page 7, I've given you a case study that we had to deal with fairly recently. I've just changed the names around. We don't deal with the Flintstones. I remember the Flintstones so well. Wilma, and I remember all the music when I was growing up. Yeah, happy times. Right, let's just look at this example, but we're looking at it from the corporate tax angle of IR35. And this is an area that a lot of accountants because they're not doing it regularly, find quite complex. But let me try and make it a bit simpler. Right, you've got Barney. He is an IT consultant, and he works through his company Rubble Limited. And he has a big client, or the company Rubble Limited. It's his company. So Barney is this IT guy, got a very successful company, and Rubble Limited's big client is Goose Limited. Unfortunately, Goose Limited comes to the conclusion correctly that the engagement is caught to IR35, and it is. Fair play to Goose Limited. It's their responsibility to look at it all. They looked at the facts. There was control, there was mutuality, and they decided that there was IR35. Right, Rubble Limited, you could circle the figure on page 7, bills £160,000 to the client Goose Limited. Goose Limited says, caught to IR35, we've got to put the 160,000 through the payroll. We've got to treat Rubble Limited's fees as if we were employing Barney. So they put the 160,000 through their payroll. They account for employers, NIC. I've said many times today, very expensive. And they put the fees through the payroll as if they were employing Barney. They deduct pay as you earn. They deduct national insurance. And the 160 gross fee, if you look on page 7, they deduct £39,000 worth of pay as you earn and national insurance. So the net fee that Rubble Limited gets is 121. Right, now, if you're producing a summary, very general summary of the first set of accounts, they will look something like this. If you turn over to page 8, they will look 121, let's say 3,000 very small expenses, allowable expenses, and you've got a profit of 118,000. That's what's happened in the company. But for corporation tax purposes, you change that. You do a different computation to go to HMRC. And there is a very important section on page 8, section 141A of the Corporation Taxes Act 2009, that makes a corporate tax adjustment. And the corporate tax adjustment is that the net fee, the deemed direct payment of 121,000, you get a credit for it in the corporate tax computation. So the computation that goes to HMRC is that one. Look at your notes on page 8. 121,000 net fee, that's the company's income, less a deduction for the deemed direct payment, 121, less your expenses, £3,000, and you end up, obviously, with a £3,000 loss. Now, we have submitted that computation into HMRC. They've agreed it. And obviously, if you've got a £3,000 loss, losses changed in 2017 for corporation tax, and losses now for a company can be carried forward against anything chargeable to corporate tax up to certain limits. So that 3,000, if you can't relieve it in the year, you could carry it forward. And if you've got some investment income in your company, that 3,000 can be carried forward against the investment income. So there's a lot of planning here. So, you know, you've got very good notes today. You want to take these notes away and have a look at them. And always remember, when you're doing the corporation tax side of IR35, you might have initial accounts like that, but the computation that goes into the revenue gives you a credit for the deemed direct payment of 121, and you end up having a small adjusted loss thanks to the expenses that you can relieve for corporation tax purposes. Right, I think you can see there's a lot of areas here, but we can help you. Just to stop before I go any further, Gravity can help you if you are uncertain if the case is caught to IR35. We could help you, as I keep saying, on your client's journey, you know, help you with the incorporation, help you review the contracts, give advice on how to set up an engagement outside of IR35, perfectly legal, just common sense. The thing you've got to do is to get in, and to get us in, I suppose, really, before the start. Otherwise, it's too late, you know, a lot of cases. Right, to finish, can I just say that there has been loads, as Tom correctly said in his introduction, there's been loads of cases on IR35 in the last few years, big cases really, where the revenue are exercising their muscle, and particularly in the entertainment industry. I know them all. I've had to lecture them, all of them. But I'm just going to select two today that I think are quite extreme that bring out IR35. Right, the first one, Dave Clark, he had this company, Little Piece of Paradise Limited. Whenever I think of the term Dave Clark, well, this Dave Clark, he was a darts presenter on Sky Sports. But if anybody mentions Dave Clark to me, I think of Dave Clark from the 1960s, showing my age here. I think of the drummer and the Dave Clark Five. Can you remember their hits? Well, I remember two, Bits and Pieces and Glad All Over. And I think Glad All Over is still the signature tune of Crystal Palace Football Club when they come out for their matches. Leyton Orient, who, as you can see, I've still got a very soft spot for. I went and saw them recently, and they still have as their signature tune when the players come out, Tiona Taxi by Herb Alpert, who I thought was a marvelous singer and musician. Anyway, this wasn't Dave Clark, the drummer. This wasn't Dave Clark Five. This was Dave Clark, the darts presenter, and he owned a company called Little Piece of Paradise Limited, and he commentated on the darts a while ago for Sky TV, and he billed Sky through his company Little Piece of Paradise Limited. As soon as I read this case, I thought, you're going to get caught to IR35, Dave, here. He was, and still is, tragically very, very ill with Parkinson's disease. And I felt so sorry for him. But, the reality is that this case, the revenue were correct to attack it under IR35. If Dave Clark had come into my office, I'd have said, Dave, it's caught to IR35. You shouldn't pursue it. Why? Well, look at the facts of the case. If you go over to page 9, the last page of your notes here today, if you go over to page 9, it was very obvious that he was a deemed employee of Sky without his company, caught to IR35. Why? I totally agree with the revenue in this case. Why? Well, to cut a long story short, Dave Clark's company really only got income from Sky. Nothing else. There was one love job, really. It was just nothing. So all the income of his company, Little Piece of Paradise, came from Sky. And what Sky did, they paid his company £150,000 a year, and they divided it by 12 monthly payments of 12,500. And those were paid whether or not he did any darts presenting. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, this is a disaster. This is going to be caught to IR35. It's like an employee on a fixed term contract with no financial risk. It was caught to IR35. The annual fee even included a financial sum for a holiday in time. Incredible. So he was a deemed employee, never appealed against the decision. And, I was amazed that that case even reached the tribunal. So that was an extreme case, really. But more recent case was the Stuart Barnes case, which was completely different and much tighter and much closer. Now, I'm not into my rugby. The sports that I follow are football, athletics, and I still run very competitively in races, and tennis. And I'm a big Emma Raducanu fan, and she won a Australian Open first round match a day or so ago, and good luck to her tomorrow. But I'm not into my rugby. I haven't got a clue about rugby. But Stuart Barnes apparently is a top rugby commentator for Sky. And this was much closer. Stuart Barnes built Sky through his company, S&L Barnes Limited, and the revenue attacked it under IR35. And he actually won, Stuart Barnes won, when he went to the first tier tribunal. And I read the case and I thought, poor, close. The revenue duly appealed, and I thought this is going to be close here one way or another. The revenue went to the upper tier tribunal. They did all the stages correctly in accordance with Kickabout. And I think really it was proved that there was some control and mutuality, but there was other factors that quite rightly the judge considered. The revenue raised. There was no right of substitute. There was no real financial risk for Barnes. Set fee. Sky provided all the equipment. And I think on the balance of everything, the revenue just about were correct. And it was caught to IR35, but a very, very close case, I think. So I'm going to finish now, and I'm just going to sort of summarize generally on IR35. I mean, as you've seen from my presentation this morning, certain areas of IR35 are very complex. We can help you because we've got a team at Gravita that are very experienced in it and can give you very good advice to potentially avoid IR35. We can give advice when you incorporate, and we can also help you when your client perhaps is on the wrong end of a wrong decision by a large engager. All of these things we could assist you for and with in the future. Now, if you do have any queries following this webinar, and I'm sure you have, or perhaps you need consultancy advice, we'd be delighted to help you. You can contact us initially through hello@gravita.com. Right, now, for the last couple of minutes, can I just highlight some of the webinars that we're putting on for you in the months ahead? Right, if you look at the screen, but if you go to Gravita's website, you can see them all, you can log on them all. And I'm just mentioning three, and I think these three are really excellent. And I would, if you've got clients in these areas, and I'm sure you all have, I would attend all three because there's a lot to be gained from attending them. The first one is on commercial property, the tax, the VAT, and all areas there. That's on Wednesday, the 5th of February, and that's going to be co-hosted with the law firm JPC. I'm back on the 20th of February, and I'm presenting my favorite subject, tax planning for the owner-managed business. You want to book up for that 20th of February. We're going to cover everything, looking at sole traders, companies, partnerships, extraction of funds from a company, you name it, it's going to be there. Capital gains tax, anti-avoidance legislation, planning for businesses. I would sum that conference up on the 20th of February as planning, tax planning for businesses, really. Right, and then finally, we've got a very interesting and useful conference, webinar on Wednesday, the 5th of March, preparing accounts under FRS 102, your step-by-step guide. There's compulsory changes. That is probably the most important one of the three. And I would strongly recommend that if that's relevant to you, you attend that on Wednesday, the 5th of March. Right, quite a busy hour we've just had. Hopefully you've found it useful. We at Gravita are very grateful for you attending. Keep in touch with us, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.